In the freezing chaos of World War II's bloodiest battle, one medic faces death at every turn. No weapons, just courage. As explosions rip through the air, he races against time to save lives. But will he survive long enough to save them all? By late 1944, the world had already seen years of unimaginable bloodshed. World War II had dragged on for over 5 years, and though the Allied forces had gained momentum after the historic D-Day invasion, the end of the war still seemed out of reach. The Allies had pushed German forces back across much of France and Belgium, bringing hope that victory was near, but Germany, battered and desperate, wasn't ready to surrender. Adolf Hitler, unwilling to accept defeat, planned a massive counterattack. His aim was to split the Allied forces, capture the Belgian port of Antwerp, and turn the tide of the war in his favor. This bold plan became known as the Ardennes Offensive, or what history would later call the Battle of the Bulge. The attack came as a complete surprise. In December 1944, most Allied troops believed the German army was too weak to mount any serious offense, especially during the brutal winter. But Hitler had gambled on the element of surprise, and it worked. Just before Christmas, German forces launched their attack through the dense Ardennes Forest, a region thought too rugged for a large-scale invasion. Under the cover of thick fog and snow, German tanks and troops smashed through the thinly spread Allied lines. The chaos was immediate. Communications broke down, and the relentless artillery fire made it impossible to regroup. Entire units were overwhelmed, forced to retreat, or worse, captured. Soldiers who had been hoping for a quiet holiday now found themselves surrounded and outnumbered. Supplies were running low, and the freezing weather was as deadly as the enemy. The Ardennes became a frozen hell. Snow covered the ground in a thick white blanket, but it wasn't beautiful, it was haunting. Beneath the snow were fallen soldiers, shattered trees, and the wreckage of war. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, and the icy wind bit through even the thickest uniforms. Soldiers struggled to keep warm, their fingers numb, and their breath visible in the frigid air. Nights in the forest were eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional crack of a rifle or the distant rumble of tank engines. In this brutal setting, survival depended not just on skill or training, but on sheer willpower. And for the medics on the battlefield, the challenge was even greater. These men were unarmed and unprotected, carrying only a red cross on their helmets to mark them as non-combatants. But that red cross was no guarantee of safety. German soldiers often ignored it, and the medics knew they could be shot at any moment. One of those medics was Private Jack Whitman, a young man barely out of high school. Like many others, he had been drafted into the war and trained in basic battlefield medicine. Before the war, Jack had dreamed of becoming a doctor, but nothing could have prepared him for the horrors he would face in the Ardennes. Jack's unit had been holding the line near a small Belgian village when the German offensive began. The first artillery shells exploded in the early hours of the morning, tearing through the quiet winter night. Jack had been asleep in a foxhole, his hands wrapped around a pair of gloves to keep warm. The sound of the first explosion jolted him awake, his heart pounding in his chest. "Medic!" someone shouted. The cry cutting through the chaos. Jack grabbed his bag and ran toward the sound, his boots crunching through the snow. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. A soldier lay sprawled on the ground, a dark red stain spreading beneath him, his leg badly injured from the blast. Jack froze for a moment, the enormity of the situation sinking in. But then his training kicked in, and he got to work. The battlefield was unforgiving. Explosions lit up the night like fireworks, and bullets whizzed past Jack's head as he worked. The cold made his hands stiff and clumsy, but he kept going, patching up wounds and dragging the injured to safety. All around him, the sounds of war raged on, shouts, screams, and the deafening roar of artillery. Jack wasn't alone in his struggle. Medics like him were scattered across the front lines, working tirelessly to save lives. But for every life they saved, there were others they couldn't reach in time. The weight of that reality was crushing, but Jack knew he couldn't afford to dwell on it. His job was to keep moving, to keep fighting, not with a gun, but with bandages and morphine. As the battle raged on, Jack began to understand just how dire the situation was. His unit was cut off from reinforcements, surrounded by German forces on all sides. Supplies were running out, and the wounded were piling up faster than the medics could treat them. But Jack refused to give up. The soldiers around him were counting on him, and he wasn't going to let them down. The Ardennes Forest tested every soldier's resolve, but for Jack, it was more than a test of endurance. It was a test of humanity. In a place where death was everywhere, Jack clung to one simple goal: to save as many lives as he could, no matter the cost. His boots sinking into the snow with each step, he didn't stop to think, didn't hesitate. Training and instinct took over, pushing him forward despite the fear that clawed at his chest. Around him, the battlefield was a scene of utter destruction. Trees splintered like matchsticks under the impact of artillery shells. Snow, once pristine and white, was churned into a grimy mix of mud and debris. Soldiers darted from cover to cover, their faces twisted in fear and determination. The air smelled of smoke, metal, and something else Jack didn't want to name. "Over here!" another voice shouted. Closer now. Jack turned and spotted a soldier lying in the open, clutching his side. A deep wound was visible beneath his hands, and the snow around him was marked by a dark stain. Jack sprinted toward the soldier, his breath fogging the icy air. Bullets zipped past him, kicking up sprays of snow and dirt. He could feel the heat of them, could hear the terrifying crack as they struck nearby, but he kept moving. His only thought was to reach the man before it was too late. Sliding to his knees beside the wounded soldier, Jack opened his bag and assessed the injury. Jack recognized the soldier, Private Richard, a young recruit who'd only joined the unit a few weeks ago. "You're gonna be okay," Jack said, more to himself than to Richard. His hands worked quickly, pulling out a bandage and pressing it firmly against the wound. Richard winced and groaned. "Am I hit bad, Doc?" he asked, his voice trembling. "It's not great, but you're tough," Jack replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just hang on for me, okay?" As Jack worked, the sounds of battle raged on around them. A mortar shell exploded nearby, showering them with dirt and snow. Jack's heart leapt, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Richard's life was in his hands, and every second mattered. "Medic, we've got more wounded back here." Another shout came from behind a cluster of trees. Jack looked up, his mind racing. Richard was seriously injured, but Jack had stabilized him enough to move. The challenge was getting him to safety. The tree line was a good 50 yards away, and the open ground between them was a death trap. "Can you hold on to me?" Jack asked, slinging Richard's arm over his shoulder. "I'll try," Richard mumbled, his strength fading fast. Jack heaved Richard up, gritting his teeth against the weight. His legs burned as he half-carried, half-dragged the soldier toward the tree line. The ground was uneven, and the snow made every step a battle of its own. Bullets continued to fly, some so close Jack felt the air ripple past his face. "Almost there," Jack muttered, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it for Richard or himself. Halfway to the trees, Jack heard a sharp crack, a sniper shot. His heart stopped. He felt the sting of something graze his arm and stumbled, nearly dropping Richard. But he forced himself to keep going, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally they reached the cover of the trees. Jack lowered Richard onto the ground and quickly checked his pulse. It was weak but steady. "You're safe now," Jack said, relief washing over him. But his respite was short-lived. "Medic, over here." Jack turned to see another soldier slumped against a tree, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. The man was clutching his rifle, his face pale and slick with sweat. Jack's exhaustion vanished as adrenaline kicked in once more. He grabbed his bag and ran to the man, his mind already calculating what he needed to do. This time, the injury was more severe. The soldier, Corporal Jenkins, had taken a piece of shrapnel to the thigh. Jack knew he had to act fast. "You're in good hands," Jack said, tearing open a tourniquet and wrapping it tightly around Jenkins's leg. "This is gonna hurt, but it'll keep you alive." Jenkins gritted his teeth and nodded, his hands trembling. As Jack worked, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. Enemy soldiers. His heart pounded as he glanced over his shoulder and saw 2 German soldiers moving cautiously through the trees, rifles raised. Jack froze, his mind racing. If they spotted him, he'd have no way to defend himself. He glanced at Jenkins, who was too weak to move. Leaving wasn't an option. Thinking quickly, Jack grabbed a broken branch lying nearby and used it to cover Jenkins with snow and debris, hiding him from view. Then Jack crouched low, using the shadows to mask his movements as he slipped away, drawing the German soldiers away from Jenkins. The enemy soldiers paused, scanning the area. Jack held his breath, every muscle in his body tensed. After what felt like an eternity, the soldiers moved on, their footsteps fading into the distance. Jack exhaled shakily and returned to Jenkins. "You're a lucky man," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's get you out of here." With the same determination as before, Jack helped Jenkins to safety. His body ached, his hands were numb, and his uniform was soaked through with snow and sweat. But he didn't care. For Jack, this was just the beginning. The battle had only just begun, and there were countless lives still to save. The battlefield was a place of unending noise and chaos, but amid the gunfire and explosions, there were moments of haunting stillness. Jack Whitman often found himself in those moments, crouched beside a soldier who was too injured to fight, their fear written across their faces. For the men he treated, Jack was more than a medic. He was their lifeline, their last hope. Jack had learned early on that his patients weren't just soldiers. They were sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers. Each one carried stories of home, dreams for the future, and memories of loved ones. But war didn't care about any of that. It tore through lives without mercy, leaving Jack to pick up the pieces. One bitterly cold afternoon, Jack was tending to a young soldier named Danny. Danny couldn't have been more than 19, his face still boyish despite the grime and smudges across it. He had been hit by shrapnel in the chest, and though Jack was doing everything he could, he knew the injury was beyond saving. Danny's breaths were shallow, his eyes wide with panic. "Am I gonna make it, Doc?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Jack swallowed hard, forcing down the lump in his throat. He couldn't tell Danny the truth. "Not here, not now." "You're gonna be fine," Jack said, his voice steady even as his heart ached. "Just hang in there." Danny nodded, clutching Jack's hand like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. Can you tell my mom I'm sorry? I didn't mean to leave her alone." Jack's chest tightened. He squeezed Danny's hand, his own fingers shaking. "I'll tell her," he promised. "But you'll tell her yourself when you get home." Danny smiled faintly, a flicker of hope in his fading eyes. A moment later, the smile vanished and his grip on Jack's hand went slack. Jack sat there for a long moment, his head bowed, the weight of Danny's death pressing down on him. He had seen so many soldiers die, but it never got easier. Each one left a scar on his heart, a reminder of how cruel war could be. Later that evening, Jack found himself sitting with a group of injured soldiers huddled around a small fire. They were a ragtag bunch, some with bandaged arms, others with bruised and dirt-streaked faces, but they were alive, and that was something to hold on to. One of the men, a burly sergeant named Miller, spoke up. "You know, Doc, I've seen a lot of medics in my time, but none like you. You don't just patch us up. You actually care." Jack looked down at his hands, still marked with dirt and red stains despite countless attempts to scrub them clean. I don't want anyone to feel like they're alone out here," he said quietly. Another soldier, Private Lewis, chimed in. "You saved me back there, Doc. I thought for sure I was done for, but you didn't give up on me. I owe you my life." Jack managed a small smile, but inside he felt hollow. For every soldier he saved, there were others he couldn't reach in time. The guilt was a constant weight, gnawing at him in the quiet moments. That night, as the men around him drifted into uneasy sleep, Jack stared at the flickering flames of the fire. He thought about Danny, about the other soldiers he had lost. Their faces haunted him, a parade of lives cut short by the brutality of war. Jack knew he wasn't the same person he had been before the war. The things he had seen, the pain, the suffering, the death, had changed him in ways he couldn't fully understand. He had come here wanting to save lives, to make a difference, but now, he wondered if he was losing himself in the process. The bonds Jack formed with his patients were both a blessing and a curse. He cared deeply for each one, but that made the losses all the more painful. He remembered the names of every soldier he had treated, even the ones who didn't make it. They weren't just casualties to him, they were people, with lives and stories that deserved to be remembered. One day, as Jack was checking on a group of wounded men, he noticed a soldier sitting apart from the others. The man was clutching a photograph, his expression distant. Jack approached him, kneeling down beside him. "Who's that?" Jack asked gently, nodding toward the photo. The soldier looked up, his eyes glassy. "My wife and little girl," he said. "She just turned 3. I promised her I'd come home." Jack nodded, his throat tight. "You will," he said firmly. "You're gonna see them again." The soldier smiled faintly, but Jack could see the doubt in his eyes. Moments like these reminded Jack of why he kept going, even when the weight of it all felt unbearable. The war had taken so much, but it hadn't taken his humanity. He refused to let it. As Jack moved on to his next patient, he took a deep breath and steadied himself. He couldn't afford to dwell on the losses or the pain. The men around him needed him, and as long as he could keep going, he would. Because for Jack, the human cost of war wasn't just about the lives lost, it was about the lives he could still save. The following morning, German troops launched a relentless assault, their artillery shaking the earth. With dwindling resources, shattered supply lines, and constant bombardment, Jack faced harrowing challenges to save lives while navigating the chaos of an ever-shifting battlefield. Jack Whitman didn't have time to think. He had been crawling through the snow, his medic's bag slung across his shoulder, searching for more wounded when he suddenly heard voices, German voices. He froze, pressing his body flat against the icy ground. The voices grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of boots on snow. Jack's heart pounded so loudly in his ears that he feared the soldiers might hear it. Peering through a tangle of frozen bushes, he saw 3 German soldiers moving cautiously, their rifles raised. They were close, too close. Jack's pulse quickened as he realized he had no cover. He was out in the open, a sitting duck. Slowly he slid his medic's bag off his shoulder and pushed it into the snow, trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, each exhale forming a faint cloud in the frigid air. He couldn't move. Any sudden motion would draw their attention. As the soldiers passed within feet of him, Jack did the only thing he could think of. He lay still and pretended to be dead. He let his body go limp, his face pressed against the snow, and hoped the red stains on his uniform would be convincing enough. The seconds dragged on like hours. Jack's muscles screamed at him to move, to flee, but he forced himself to stay still. He could hear their voices, low and urgent, though he didn't understand the words. One of them laughed, a cold, harsh sound that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. The crunching of boots stopped. Jack's heart nearly stopped with them. One of the soldiers had paused just a few feet away. Jack could hear him shifting, could feel the weight of his gaze. He bit down hard on his lip, fighting the urge to flinch as a shadow passed over him. A long, agonizing moment later, the soldier moved on, his boots crunching through the snow once more. Jack waited until their voices faded into the distance before daring to lift his head. His body was trembling, his breath ragged, but he was alive. Jack retrieved his medic's bag and began crawling toward a patch of trees for better cover. His mind raced with what-ifs. What if they'd spotted him? What if they'd decided to check if he was alive? He pushed the thoughts away. There was no time for fear. There was work to do. As he reached the tree line, Jack heard a faint sound. At first he thought it was the wind, but then he realized it was a moan, soft, pained, and unmistakably human. He turned his head, scanning the area, and saw a figure lying in the snow. It was a German soldier. The man was young, barely older than a boy, his face pale and contorted with pain. He clutched his side, where his uniform was darkened and the snow beneath him was stained from his injury. Jack's first instinct was to look away, to move on. This was the enemy, the same enemy that had killed so many of his comrades. But as he looked into the soldier's eyes, he saw something that made him pause: fear. The young man wasn't a threat. He was just a scared, injured boy fighting for his life. Jack's hands tightened on the strap of his bag as he struggled with what to do. He had made an oath to save lives, but this wasn't one of his men. Could he risk everything to help the enemy? Bitte, the soldier whispered, his voice weak and pleading. Jack didn't know much German, but he didn't need to. The soldier's tone said everything. Against his better judgment, Jack knelt beside the soldier and opened his bag. The man flinched at first, but Jack held up his hands, showing he wasn't armed. "I'm here to help," he said softly, hoping the soldier understood. The injury was severe. He had been hit in the side, and it hadn't stopped worsening. Jack worked quickly, pressing a bandage over the injured part of his body to stabilize it. The soldier winced but didn't resist. As Jack worked, he couldn't help but notice how young the man looked. He probably had a family waiting for him back home, just like the men Jack treated every day. "Hold still," Jack said as he tied the bandage in place. The soldier's breathing slowed, his face relaxing as the pain subsided. Jack felt a strange mix of emotions: relief that he'd been able to help, guilt for aiding the enemy, and anger at the war that had brought them both to this frozen battlefield. Suddenly the sound of voices shattered the fragile peace. Jack's head snapped up, his heart pounding. The German soldier's comrades were returning. Jack looked at the wounded soldier, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. Jack knew he had to leave. If the other soldiers found him here, they wouldn't hesitate to kill him. "Stay quiet," Jack whispered, hoping the soldier understood. Then he grabbed his bag and slipped back into the shadows, moving as quickly and silently as he could. He didn't stop until he was far enough away that he could no longer hear the voices. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. As he leaned against a tree, his chest heaving, Jack couldn't shake the image of the young soldier's face. In that moment, the lines between friend and enemy had blurred. The boy he had saved wasn't a nameless foe. He was a person, just like the men Jack fought beside. Jack sat there for a while, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. He thought about the lives he'd saved and the lives he couldn't, about the cost of doing what was right in a world turned upside down by war. For Jack, the war wasn't just about fighting the enemy. It was about holding on to his humanity in a place that seemed determined to strip it away. The Ardennes Forest wasn't just a battlefield, it was a frozen prison. The cold was unrelenting, a biting force that seeped into every inch of a soldier's body no matter how many layers they wore. Jack Whitman, like the others, had long since stopped feeling his toes. The frost-bitten skin on his hands cracked and bled as he worked, but he couldn't stop. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of glass, and the snow seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, an unforgiving white expanse broken only by the blackened skeletons of trees. The medic's bag on Jack's shoulder felt heavier with each step, and his stomach gnawed at him with hunger. The rations, what little they had, were frozen solid, and trying to eat was almost more trouble than it was worth. For Jack, the cold wasn't just a nuisance. It was a deadly enemy. It froze his bandages, stiffened his fingers, and turned simple tasks into monumental challenges. Pulling a tourniquet tight on a soldier's leg could take twice as long when his hands were numb, and every second wasted was a second closer to death. For the wounded, he had to improvise constantly. When his morphine vials froze, he rubbed them between his palms until his skin burned. When his scissors became too stiff to cut, he used the edge of a soldier's bayonet. Jack knew that out here, creativity could mean the difference between life and death. But no matter how hard he worked, the elements seemed determined to crush their spirits. Frostbite was a constant threat, and Jack saw men lose fingers and toes to the cold. Their faces, raw and chapped, carried the hollow look of exhaustion. Some barely spoke anymore, their words stolen by the brutal conditions. Jack's own body was failing him. His hands trembled as he wrapped a bandage around a soldier's arm, and he had to bite down on his lip to stop his teeth from chattering. He couldn't let the others see his weakness. They depended on him to be strong, to keep going when everything else felt impossible. One afternoon, Jack was making his way through the snow, searching for the injured. The icy wind howled around him, whipping through the trees like a living thing. He had just finished helping a soldier with a bullet wound when he heard a faint cry for help. Jack froze, his ears straining. The cry came again, barely audible over the wind. He turned toward the sound and saw a figure lying motionless on the other side of a steep ridge. The ridge was treacherous, the snow hiding patches of ice and loose rocks that could send him tumbling. But Jack didn't hesitate. He tightened the strap on his bag and began the climb, his boots slipping with every step. The wind grew stronger as he neared the top, biting at his face and threatening to knock him off balance. Jack gritted his teeth, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pulled himself up. His muscles screamed in protest, but he pushed on, one handhold at a time. When he finally reached the top, he saw the wounded soldier sprawled in the snow below. Dark red stains marked the white ground around him, a stark reminder of the urgency of the situation. Jack slid down the ridge as carefully as he could, his heart pounding. He reached the soldier's side and dropped to his knees, checking his condition. A piece of shrapnel had struck the man's leg, and he was clearly in distress. "Hang on," Jack said, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at him. He fumbled with his bag, his frozen fingers struggling to pull out the supplies he needed. The soldier let out a faint groan, his face pale and damp with sweat despite the freezing air. Jack moved quickly, securing a makeshift band around the man's thigh to help stabilize him. His hands trembled as he tied the knot, the cold making every movement more difficult. Just as Jack began to bandage the wound, the snow beneath him shifted. He froze, feeling the ground give way slightly beneath his knees. He was on a precarious slope, and one wrong move could send both him and the soldier sliding down the ridge. Jack swallowed hard, his breath fogging in front of him. He moved as slowly as he could, anchoring his weight as he worked. The wind howled around him, tugging at his coat and threatening to pull him off balance. When the bandage was secure, Jack looked at the soldier. "We have to move," he said. "Can you hold on to me?" The soldier nodded weakly and Jack slipped an arm under his shoulders, hoisting him up. The added weight made Jack's legs tremble, but he gritted his teeth and began the slow climb back up the ridge. Every step was a battle, the snow shifted beneath their feet, and Jack could feel his strength fading, but he refused to stop. He focused on the soldier's breathing, using it as a rhythm to keep himself moving. When they finally reached the top, Jack collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The soldier slumped against him, his eyes half closed. Jack took a moment to steady himself before continuing, dragging the man toward a small cluster of trees where he could finish treating the wound. As he worked, Jack couldn't help but marvel at the sheer willpower it took for these men to survive. The war wasn't just about bullets and bombs, it was a fight against the elements, against hunger, against exhaustion, and somehow they kept going. Jack finished bandaging the soldier's leg and gave him a small smile. "You're gonna be okay," he said, his voice hoarse but filled with determination. The soldier nodded weakly, his lips cracking as he tried to smile back. Jack sat back for a moment, his body aching and his breath coming in shallow gasps. He knew the battle wasn't over. Not for him, not for any of them, but as long as there were lives to save, he would keep going, no matter how brutal the conditions. Because in this frozen hellscape, hope was the only thing keeping them alive. Amid the chaos of the Ardennes, the bonds formed between soldiers were often the only steady thing they had. For Jack Whitman, one bond stood out above the rest: his friendship with Private John Miller. John wasn't just another soldier. He was the man who had saved Jack's life during a brutal firefight in Normandy months earlier. Jack would never forget that day. He had been pinned down by enemy fire, his options dwindling, when John appeared out of nowhere, risking everything to drag Jack to safety. Now, as Jack trudged through the snow, exhaustion tugging at every fiber of his being, he heard a voice call out, a voice he recognized immediately. "Medic, over here!" Jack's head snapped toward the sound. His heart dropped when he saw John lying in the snow, a fellow soldier kneeling beside him, waving frantically for help. Without thinking, Jack sprinted toward them, his boots slipping on the icy ground. When he reached John, his stomach churned at the sight before him. Dark stains spread beneath John's body, marking the snow. He had been struck in the abdomen, and his face was pale, his breath shallow. "John," Jack said, dropping to his knees. His voice shook, but he tried to keep it steady. "I'm here, I've got you." John's eyes fluttered open, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. "Took you long enough, Whitman," he whispered, his voice weak but laced with the same humor that had kept their spirits up during darker days. Jack forced a smile, but his hands were already moving, pulling out supplies from his bag. The other soldier beside John spoke quickly. "He's badly injured. We couldn't move him." Jack nodded, his mind racing. The wound was bad, worse than anything he had hoped for. He pressed a bandage against John's abdomen to stabilize him, but the crimson stain spread too quickly, soaking through the fabric. "Hang on, John," Jack said, his voice tight. "I'm going to get you out of here." John groaned, his head lolling to the side. Jack could see the pain etched into his friend's face, and it tore at him. This wasn't just any soldier. This was John, the man who had saved his life. As Jack worked, the sounds of battle raged in the distance. Artillery shells boomed, and the occasional crack of gunfire echoed through the trees. Time was against them, and Jack knew it. He made a quick assessment of the situation. John's wound was deep, and he needed surgery, something Jack couldn't provide out here in the freezing forest. The only chance was to get him to an aid station, but that meant crossing open ground, exposed to enemy fire. Jack glanced at the soldier beside him. "Help me lift him," he said. "We're getting him out of here." The soldier hesitated. "The Germans are still out there. It's too dangerous." Jack's jaw tightened. "I don't care. We're not leaving him here." Together they hoisted John onto a makeshift stretcher, using 2 rifles and a torn blanket. John groaned in pain, his hand gripping Jack's sleeve. "Jack," he murmured, his voice barely audible, "you don't have to do this." Jack leaned close, his voice firm. "You didn't leave me behind in Normandy, and I'm not leaving you now. Just hold on." They began the slow, perilous trek toward the aid station. The snow was deep, and every step felt like a struggle. Jack's shoulders ached from carrying the weight of the stretcher, but he didn't stop. Then, just as they reached a clearing, the sound of a rifle shot rang out. Jack's heart leapt into his throat. "Down!" he shouted, dropping to the ground and pulling the stretcher with him. The soldier with him dove for cover, scanning the tree line for the source of the shot. Jack's eyes darted around, his pulse pounding in his ears. They were exposed, sitting ducks in the middle of the clearing. Another shot cracked through the air, hitting the ground just inches from the stretcher. Jack's mind raced. They couldn't stay here, but moving meant risking everything. "Stay low," he told the other soldier. "We're moving him." With the bullets still flying, they crawled across the snow, dragging the stretcher behind them. The cold bit into Jack's hands and knees, but he didn't care. His only focus was getting John to safety. Finally, they reached a cluster of trees, and the gunfire ceased. Jack slumped against the trunk of a tree, his chest heaving. John's breathing was shallow, his skin alarmingly pale. Jack knew he was running out of time. John's pulse was growing weaker by the second. He opened his bag, pulling out everything he had left: bandages, morphine, anything that might help. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that gnawed at him. Then he saw it. The shrapnel had nicked an artery. His heart sank. This wasn't something he could fix. John's eyes flickered open, and he looked at Jack. "How bad is it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jack hesitated, his throat tightening. He wanted to lie, to tell John everything would be fine, but the look in his friend's eyes told him the truth wouldn't be a surprise. "It's bad," Jack admitted, his voice cracking. "But I'm not giving up on you." John gave a faint nod, his hand gripping Jack's. "You've done enough, Jack," he said. "You've always done enough." Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly powerless. The other soldier looked at Jack. "We have to keep moving. He won't make it here." Jack nodded, his jaw clenched. He took a deep breath and stood, hoisting the stretcher once more. The journey to the aid station felt like an eternity. Every step was a battle, every moment filled with doubt. Jack knew they might not make it, but he refused to stop. When they finally reached the station, Jack collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. The medics there took over, rushing John inside. Jack sat outside, his head in his hands. For the first time, he allowed himself to cry. John had saved his life once, and now Jack had done everything he could to return the favor. Hours later, one of the medics emerged from the station. Jack looked up, his heart pounding. "He's alive," the medic said, his voice weary. "But it's going to be a long road." Relief washed over Jack and he let out a shaky breath. John had made it barely. As Jack sat there staring out at the frozen forest, he realized something. The war had taken so much from all of them, but it hadn't taken their humanity, and as long as they had each other they could keep fighting, no matter the odds. As the battle raged on, the medic's role was one of constant adaptation. There was no time for hesitation. In the midst of enemy fire, when supplies were scarce and the cold seemed to numb everything around him, Jack Whitman had learned to improvise, often with nothing more than what he could scrounge from the battlefield. It wasn't just about being quick anymore, it was about being resourceful. In the heat of battle, when wounded soldiers were piling up by the minute, Jack's ingenuity became just as important as his medical skills. One day, during a particularly brutal skirmish, Jack found himself in the thick of it once again. The shelling had been relentless, and the wounded were coming in faster than he could handle. There was no time to waste, and yet the challenges seemed to grow by the second. The first casualty came in quickly. A young private, barely out of his teens, was brought to him, his arm nearly severed by shrapnel. The soldier's face was pale with shock. Jack could hear the ringing in his ears from the explosion, but he focused on the task at hand. His first instinct was to provide him some relief, an urgent task, but the issue was that the medical supplies had dwindled. The gauze was almost gone, and there wasn't enough bandaging left to cover the wound. Thinking quickly, Jack grabbed a handful of field rations and used the foil packaging to apply pressure to the wound. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. He wrapped it tightly with his own shirt, applying all the force he could without cutting off circulation. "Hang in there," Jack said softly, trying to reassure the soldier, even though his own heart was pounding in his chest. The private's eyes were wide with panic, but he nodded weakly. As Jack worked, he couldn't help but think about how far he'd come since the beginning of the war. In the early days he had been a bit hesitant, unsure of his own abilities when it came to the stress of combat. But now, amid the chaos and constant threat of death, his quick thinking and ability to adapt had become a lifeline for countless soldiers. The pressure of the situation didn't faze him. He had no choice but to make do with what he had, and today that meant using everything from ration packets to his own jacket to stabilize this private's arm. After the possible first aid for now, Jack moved on to the next casualty. A soldier had been hit in the leg by a mortar shell, and the wound was deep. His breathing was ragged, and Jack knew there wasn't much time. He quickly assessed the situation and realized that traditional medical supplies were useless in this moment. What he had on hand was limited. He had no antibiotics left, and barely enough field dressings to make it through the day. He needed to act fast. Jack looked around and found a wooden plank, something from the remains of a nearby shed. It wasn't much, but it could work. He carefully placed it beneath the soldier's leg, using a torn strip of cloth to tie it in place, creating a makeshift splint. The soldier groaned in pain, but Jack pressed on. "Stay with me," he said. "We're going to get you out of here." As he worked, a familiar sound reached his ears, the distant whistling of incoming shells. Jack didn't flinch. He'd become accustomed to that sound. It was the way the ground would shake afterward that always made him tense. The next shell hit close. The ground shook violently, and dirt sprayed into the air. Jack could feel the pressure in his chest as the shockwave hit, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Another soldier came stumbling toward him, clutching his side, his uniform torn in multiple places. Jack didn't need to ask what happened. He could see the wound, an open gash on the soldier's side where a piece of shrapnel had torn through. It was bad. "Jack, get him help!" another medic shouted, running past him, but Jack wasn't going anywhere. He was the one with the supplies, the one who had to act. The situation was critical, and Jack knew he had to think fast. He had no clean equipment left, but the soldier was in a serious danger. Looking around desperately, Jack spotted a tattered sheet that had been left behind by a previous casualty. It wasn't clean, but it would have to do. He used the sheet to pack the wound, applying direct pressure to stabilize the wound. It wasn't the ideal method, but it was the only option. Then, without warning, an explosion went off nearby, and Jack was thrown to the ground. For a split second, everything went dark. His head throbbed, and his ears rang, but he quickly shook himself awake. He had no time to waste. The soldier was still breathing, but just barely. Jack scrambled to his feet, his legs shaky, and forced himself to focus. The medic grabbed a nearby bayonet and used it to carefully cut away the soldier's tattered uniform. He needed to expose the wound completely. With nothing but his hands and the makeshift medical tools, Jack pressed down on the wound, praying it would be enough. He applied another makeshift dressing, knowing that without proper medical equipment, it was nothing more than a temporary fix. "Stay with me," Jack muttered again. Even though his own heart was racing, he felt the weight of every life he was trying to save pressing down on him. But in that moment, there was no choice. Jack didn't have the luxury of time. The sound of enemy artillery was getting louder. Jack didn't know how much longer he had. He had to finish what he'd started, and there was no way he could afford to fail. Then, just as Jack was starting to feel the exhaustion take over, a voice shouted in the distance. It was a fellow medic, running toward him with supplies. Jack almost couldn't believe it. Relief flooded through him. It wasn't a moment too soon. Jack gave the soldier one last check, ensuring he would survive long enough to get the proper care, and then moved on to the next. Through it all, Jack kept moving, no matter the odds, no matter the obstacles. His determination to save every soldier, to do whatever it took to keep them alive, had become his guiding force. He didn't think of himself. He didn't think of the danger. He only thought of one thing: saving as many lives as possible, even if it meant risking his own. The shells kept falling, the cold kept biting, but Jack kept fighting. And for the soldiers he treated, he became their hope in a war that seemed to have none. The days bled into each other, and the cold never seemed to stop. Jack Whitman could hardly remember the last time he'd felt warmth or had a proper meal. The relentless battle, the ceaseless bombardments, the screams of the wounded, everything felt like a blur. Every day was the same. He was on his feet from dawn until dusk, rushing from one injured soldier to the next, never stopping for rest, barely even pausing to take a breath. His body was aching, bruised and covered in dirt. His hands trembled from exhaustion and the cold. The frostbite that had set in weeks ago hadn't gotten any better, and his fingers felt numb most of the time. But it didn't matter. There was no time to worry about pain. The constant bombardment was the hardest part. The ground shook every few minutes from the explosions, and the air was thick with dust and smoke. The sound of artillery shells crashing and gunfire never stopped. It was a never-ending storm of chaos and death. Jack had gotten so used to it that at times he didn't even hear it anymore, but that didn't mean he could escape it. His feet were sore from walking so much, and his back ached from carrying heavy medical packs. He hadn't had a real rest in weeks. The sleep he did get was broken, and each time he closed his eyes he saw the faces of the soldiers he had tried and failed to save. One afternoon, as Jack moved through the trenches carrying what little medical supplies he had left, the weight of it all finally began to crush him. He paused for a moment, looking out over the desolate battlefield. The icy winds cut through him like daggers, and the sky above was a dull, unrelenting gray. He was cold, tired, and worn to the bone. He felt as though he was just going through the motions, unable to give more. His mind wandered back to a memory from before the war, before everything had changed. It was the day he'd promised his younger brother Tommy that he would come back safe. Jack could still hear his brother's voice, full of worry, as he had stood at the train station, watching Jack leave. "Don't forget, Jack. You promised you'd come back." Jack had smiled and ruffled Tommy's hair, trying to make it seem like there was nothing to worry about. "I'll be back before you know it, little man," he had said, even though a part of him had been unsure. But he'd made the promise, a promise he couldn't break. The memory of Tommy's face, filled with hope, flooded Jack's mind. That was all he needed to keep going. He couldn't stop now. Not after everything he'd seen, and certainly not after making that promise. The exhaustion in his bones was overwhelming, but Jack refused to let it take him. He straightened up, forcing his body to move again, pushing through the numbness and fatigue. The weight of his pack felt heavier than it ever had before, but his mind was clear. There was no choice. He had to keep going. His mind also turned to the soldiers around him, the young men who depended on him. Jack had always prided himself on being the one to stay calm in the middle of chaos, the one who could think clearly when everything else was falling apart. Now his own resolve was what would keep them going. Jack's leadership had become a lifeline for the soldiers who had made it this far. He never asked for recognition or praise. He just did what needed to be done. His presence alone brought a sense of relief to those who were fighting beside him. They knew that no matter what happened, Jack would be there, doing whatever it took to save lives. It was on the worst days when the fighting was fiercest, when there seemed to be no hope left, that Jack's determination shone brightest. He worked without pause, without rest, putting his own well-being aside for the sake of the others. "Jack, you all right?" a voice called out from behind him. It was Corporal Smith, a young soldier who had been with Jack since the early days of the battle. His face was worn with exhaustion, but there was still a look of respect in his eyes. Jack turned to him and gave a half-hearted smile. "Just fine. We've got work to do, right?" He didn't have the energy to say more. Smith hesitated for a moment, then said, "We're all counting on you, Jack. You keep us going." The words hit Jack harder than he expected. In the middle of the chaos, with the noise of war roaring all around him, it was the quiet moments like this when someone reminded him of his importance that gave him the strength to keep pushing forward. "Thank you, Smith," Jack said quietly. "Let's get back to it." And so Jack did. He made his way through the trenches, moving quickly from one soldier to the next. Each one needed something: bandages, pain relief, someone to reassure them that they weren't alone. Jack did it all, and when he couldn't do enough, he made sure they knew he hadn't given up on them. Despite the growing weight on his shoulders, Jack's resolve only strengthened. He wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not while his brothers in arms were counting on him. And in that moment, with the memory of Tommy's face still fresh in his mind, Jack made a promise to himself. He would keep fighting. Not just for survival, but for the men who needed him. He had made a promise to come home, and while he couldn't be sure of what the future held, he would give everything he had to make sure his men survived. As the sun set behind the battlefield, casting a cold, eerie glow over the frozen landscape, Jack knew he had reached his breaking point. But that didn't matter. The only thing that mattered now was the promise he had made, and the lives he was fighting to save. He wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. The battle was at its peak, and the situation had never looked worse. The snow continued to fall, a heavy, suffocating blanket covering the frozen ground. The air smelled of gunpowder, and the sound of artillery was relentless. Jack Whitman, the lone medic, had already pushed his body and mind to the absolute limits. He was exhausted, more than anyone could imagine. His body was a canvas of bruises, and the constant ache of exhaustion. His hands, numb and stiff from the cold, moved mechanically as he treated another soldier, but his heart was heavy with the weight of everything that had come before. The German forces were advancing quickly. The Allied lines were crumbling under the force of the enemy's surprise counteroffensive, and as always Jack was at the front, doing what he could to save those around him. He'd seen countless soldiers wounded, some of them he had known for years, others just boys who had signed up for the war thinking they could change the world, and now they were lying in the mud, badly injured and exhausted, waiting for anyone to come to their aid. But Jack was only one man. His medical supplies were running low, and there were far more casualties than he could tend to, and yet he kept moving. He couldn't stop now, not when so many lives depended on him, not when he had made a promise to never give up. The unit was taking heavy fire. The men had dug into the trenches, trying to hold their position against the relentless German assault. Jack had already been treating soldiers for hours when the call came. Another group of soldiers was pinned down further up the line, and they needed help now. Without hesitation, Jack grabbed his medical pack and set off, running through the frozen wasteland. He didn't even feel the cold anymore. His body was numb, and all he could focus on was reaching the wounded before it was too late. The sounds of gunfire rang in his ears, and the ground shook with explosions, but none of it mattered. Jack moved forward, each step taking him closer to the soldiers who needed him. But as he neared the location, something unexpected happened. A mortar shell exploded nearby, sending a shockwave through the ground. Jack was thrown to the ground, his head spinning from the blast. His vision blurred as he struggled to regain his balance, because he didn't have time to stop. There were lives at stake. Through the smoke and dust, Jack saw a soldier lying in the snow, barely moving. It was Corporal Smith, the young soldier who had always looked up to him, the one who had kept him going on the worst days. He had been with Jack since the very beginning, always by his side, always following his lead. And now, he was barely conscious, struggling to breathe. Jack's heart clenched in his chest. He couldn't lose Smith. Not now. Ignoring the pain in his own body, Jack crawled over to Smith, dragging himself through the snow with every ounce of strength he had left. The sounds of battle raged around them, but Jack only had eyes for his friend. "Smith, stay with me," Jack said, his voice strained. "You're going to be all right. I've got you." Smith barely managed to open his eyes, a faint smile crossing his face. "You always say that, Jack," he murmured weakly, "but this time, I don't know." Jack didn't have time for this. He had to act quickly. He pressed his hands to the wound, trying to stabilize his wounds, but it was bad, much worse than he had expected. Smith was fading fast. Jack's mind raced. What could he do? How could he save him? He ripped open his medical pack, trying to find anything that could help, but everything was frozen solid. His bandages, his gauze, even his morphine. Nothing was going to work in this cold. Jack's chest tightened, as he realized that despite his best efforts, Smith might not make it. But then, an idea struck him. There was no time to hesitate. Jack quickly stripped off his outer layers of clothing, wrapping them around Smith's body to try and keep him warm. He couldn't risk hypothermia setting in. At the same time, he applied pressure to the wound, praying that it would be enough. Suddenly, another explosion echoed in the distance, closer this time. Jack froze, his heart racing. He had to get Smith out of there, and fast, but the way was blocked. Enemy soldiers were moving closer, their rifles trained on anything that moved. Jack's mind raced. There was no way he could move Smith on his own, not with the odds stacked so high against them. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. But if he stayed here, Smith would die. If he didn't act, the soldier he had promised to protect would be gone. Then, in a moment of clarity, Jack made a choice. He looked around, seeing the faint shadows of German soldiers approaching. He could hear them talking in low voices. There was no time to hesitate. He had to move, and he had to move fast. Without thinking, Jack grabbed Smith and hauled him to his feet, supporting him as best he could. He moved quickly, ducking behind debris, trying to stay out of sight. The soldiers were close now, just a few feet away. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he pressed Smith's body against the cold stone wall of a ruined building, trying to hide them both from view. The seconds felt like hours. Jack held his breath, praying they wouldn't be spotted. He couldn't let them see him. He couldn't let them know he was there. But luck wasn't on his side. One of the German soldiers turned and spotted them. Jack knew there was no way to avoid a confrontation. He made a snap decision. He pushed Smith back, out of sight, and drew the attention of the enemy soldiers, hoping to give the others time to escape. As the German soldiers charged forward, Jack took the first few shots. They missed, but the next one didn't. He felt the bullet pierce his side, a sharp, burning pain that made him gasp. The world seemed to spin around him, but his focus never wavered. He couldn't let them reach Smith. He couldn't let them reach the others. In the final moments, as his strength ebbed away, Jack's thoughts turned to the men he had saved, those who would survive because of the choices he had made, the sacrifices he had endured. He thought of Tommy, his little brother, and the promise he had made to come home. As the world around him went dark, Jack knew that in the end, it was worth it. His sacrifice had saved lives. His legacy would live on in the soldiers who had made it through the battle, and they would tell his story of a medic who gave everything, who never stopped fighting no matter what the cost. When the fighting finally ended, and the snow began to melt, the men of Jack's unit would remember him, not as a hero but as a brother, the one who had kept them alive when it seemed impossible, the one who had given everything for them, and through their stories Jack's legacy would live on, reminding everyone that sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones who never ask for recognition, the ones who sacrifice it all for others. If you're proud of American war heroes and want to hear more stories like these, subscribe to our channel and share it with your friends.